It is.
Because I also want to kind of move into the conversation about reclaiming our historic spaces. And that's where you and I met, right?
Yes.
And so one of our first projects at SOWEGA Rising was being able to save the Ritz Cultural Center. So we heard kind of this rumor that our local city officials were about to tear down the Ritz Cultural Center so that they can build a parking lot for this new transportation center that they were building. And so when we got wind of that, we were like, absolutely not. Like, this is a major, like, part of the Black story in Albany. We cannot allow that to be demolished. And we knew the decision makers were people that weren't even from this area, right? That didn't understand how important that space was to our people. And so we did a petition. We got about over 600 names on this petition. And we went to the city officials and we were like, look, don't tear down this space. We want to keep this space. And the space for, it had been vacant for a while. It was starting to deteriorate really bad. But thankfully, after some pushing and building a movement around that, we were able to get them to stop the demolition. So we got that done. And then we were like challenged by the then city manager who said, you all need to raise some money. So if you can raise some money for this space, then we'll keep it from being demolished. So we were like, okay, bet, we'll raise some money. And so we started advocating to our local congressman. I got to give a shout out to Congressman Bishop, Sanford Bishop, who allocated $2.1 million towards the rebuilding of this space. So that was a huge victory for us, but the fight wasn't over. We then knew that Harlem was now being threatened towards possible gentrification because we knew they built this great transportation center. And so the next step was, okay, what are the plans going to be for this area? We wanted to make sure our voices were in the plans because Harlem is a historic Black community. So can you talk a little bit about why Harlem is so important to Albany? I know the history, but tell the people why Harlem is so important.
Absolutely. Harlem served as a hub, a safe space, a haven for African Americans in Albany, Georgia during a time when they didn't have a voice and proper equal representation.
Right.
The first doctors, the first attorneys, the first beauty shops for African Americans were all in Harlem. The first movie theater, which the Ritz Cultural Center started out as being, was in Harlem. My mother shared stories of how my grandparents would drop she and her siblings off in Harlem to go to the Ritz, which was a theater at the time, in complete safety, knowing that they could come back in a couple hours and that they were in an area where no one would harm them. And they would be treated like kids.
You had dignity, too.
Dignity, yes.
Because you didn't have to walk in the back of the theater. Like our Albany theater, Black folks had to go to the back, had to sit up in the balcony
in the balcony,
area.
Although those were the best seats, and that's the way
actually.
Yes, that's the way the Creator has a way of balancing things out and making you put into a position of authority when one thinks they're putting you to a position of submission. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I love that. And so we had dignity in Harlem. We were able to walk through the front door. I understand, like, there was so much traffic in Harlem because people were coming from all over the different cities around this area, and they would get dressed up to the nines.
Yes, put on your best to go, and that's where you knew that you would be respected.
Right.
And like you say, treated with dignity. Martin Luther King visited Harlem. The Albany movement started in Harlem with them being at a place called Dick Q's Room.
Dick Gay.
Yes.
Dick Gay's pool hall.
Q Room. Yes,
it's
it's in. You can go look it up in the archives in University of Georgia, as well as Georgia State has some archives of video of him and Ralph D. Abernathy talking to the local Albany citizens, talking about the first march that had happened. I think it was July 24th, 62.
Okay.
So I only know this because I just gave a
Listen,
presentation.
don't you have to tell people that. He knows what he knows. That's what he knows.
This is so it's just great to be able to see that footage that could have been lost, that brings some truth and validity to stories that we've heard. History does not change if it's told correctly. And so having this video and having living legends that can tell us what happened is uber important to us restoring Harlem, ensuring that it maintains the history of the African diaspora that it once represented. And coming back in an era where, although we don't suffer from necessary legal oppositions that we once did, there still is a cultural need for us to be able to empower our history for the world to know the true history of African Americans in this country. So this will be a melting pot.
Absolutely. And it's so important because, especially, this is Black History Month. It's the month that they designated for us to have. But anyways.
28 days, the shortest month of the year. Yes.
So we recognize that our spaces, our land, the places that we are trying to preserve that are being threatened right now, right? People are coming in and wanting to gentrify the area. This reclamation is so critical because this is American history, right? Those spaces are a part of the fabric of American history. And so gentrification is, let's talk about gentrification, right? Because I don't think this generation understands what it looks like for gentrification. So we knew when they were about to demolish our historic Ritz Cultural Center and Ritz Theater that they hid, our local leaders did not put on their documents what the building was. They just put a parcel code. So the average person is not going to know what this parcel code is, won't even research it. And so thankfully it was a white gentleman that just is always watching our city that let us know, no, this parcel code is the Ritz Cultural Center. So they thought they were tricky. They thought they were going to be, they thought they were sneaky with it. And so thankfully we have allies, right, that understand the importance of our spaces. But talk to people about, because I know you've seen this. I know you lived in D.C.
Yes.
And I know you've seen how they've gentrified areas in D.C. that were also historic Black places. What does it look like? Help people understand like those symbols of gentrification.
So I actually saw the gentrification of D.C. and New York.
Okay.
I lived through both of those. And it was ironic. I left D.C. in 2004 to move to New York. And I came back to visit in 2006, and I did not recognize the city. I didn't recognize 14th Street, which was a major metro stop for Howard students and anybody that lived in that northwest area of D.C. All of a sudden, we had a Target, a Best Buy, Starbucks, Home Goods, and I was like, I actually didn't know where I was. I looked around and I was disoriented.
Right.
Happy to see these new businesses, but in the coming of the new businesses, lost the community and the people who had been there for years. The rent was raised, the houses were torn down and demolished.
So, let's go back a little bit, though, because there's the pioneers, right, that come into the neighborhood. And when you see the little white woman walking the dog, that's when you know you're about to be gentrified.
Yeah.
When you see the yoga studios start popping up and they're out on the lawns with their yoga mats, that's when you know you're about to be gentrified.
We actually had a saying. It's first actually the gays move into the community, then the yuppies move into the community, and then it is overtaken completely by white culture. So it's like, I guess and there's a ideology behind that now that I think about it. The gay community is one that's been marginalized. So they can be allowed to move into an area where people don't want to live anyway, and they'll be well received because they're not welcome in the mainstream.
Wow.
Then once they lay the foundation and do all the work, then come the yuppies because they have the, trust funds and they're able to financially come in. The parents have positioned them to be able to renovate these areas to set them up and their children.
And that's when you start to see, like you talked about, the Starbucks, the Targets, the Whole Foods, because that's the
Caribou
care
coffee.
And feeding of the yuppies. So,
Absolutely, yeah. And so it's a process.
Right.
It's a process that we don't see much like that parcel code.
Yeah.
Because it's done hidden.
It's hidden in plain sight. I think we don't understand that these are the signs of gentrification.
Right.
And so, like you said, a lot of times they move in, property values go up. Our taxes go up, and then we can no longer afford our spaces that we live in. So we start seeing people putting the for sale signs out.
Yeah.
And then that's when they start putting together the neighborhood associations, and they start whispering and talking about, okay, this place is available. Who can we move into this place?
Yes. The school district comes up.
Right. The speed bumps started coming into the around. So these are the signs of gentrification, and so Harlem is right on the cusp of that.
Yeah.
Right. We have a lot of people that are having conversations about what types of investors can come into this area and what types of businesses do we want to see. And so that's why it was so important when they started having those revitalization plan meetings, which I'll just give you another shady moment. So our organization was able to raise $25,000. We were able to actually be a part of a grant that the city applied for $25,000 that would have been used for a revitalization plan for Harlem. because our local mayor did not want our organization to be involved with that, they sat on the $25,000 and did not spend it.
Wow.
And ended up having to pay that money back.
Wow.
And so about a year later, they used money from the city's budget to fund their own plan that they could control, so that they could control the narrative and what happens with that plan. So thankfully, when we found out they were having these meetings, we pushed it out to the entire community. As you saw, those rooms were packed to capacity, so that we can make sure that we had our input in those meetings. And it was so powerful that most people wanted to make sure the story and the culture was preserved in Harlem, because we knew that would be the first thing that would be taken out of the community, that the history and the narrative needed to be preserved. And so you were a part of that, and you really spoke. That was when I first met this man. I was like, who is that in the back of the room that is like letting these people know how this works? And so why was that so important for you to like really push for our voices to be heard?
Once again, I was thrown